Hello, my friend. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, I have been meditating on an issue for a very long while, which is pretty consequential, I think, to the perpetuation of the American experiment and the enjoyment of all of our liberties, and that is the issue of policing and/or law enforcement, particularly as it relates to the framework of America, particularly as it relates to our existence as Americans. Now, there are, of course, plenty of other things to be talked about as it relates to law enforcement in other countries, but I can't tackle that in this video, so maybe another video. But I recently saw a story where it demonstrated two cops arresting people for doing something that was really inconsequential. I forgot exactly what it was. And there have been instances of cops, shutting down lemonade stands or just doing things that people deem excessive. And of course, the killing of George Floyd, which I personally believe was a murder, that has also sparked a different paradigm, or it has given life and given recognition to a different paradigm by which many people view the police, and that is through a racial justice paradigm. And of course, this has sparked claims that cops are inherently racist, that they are inherently going to oppress black folks, that black folks are scared of the cops, and then there's all these other myths from the 80s and 70s, driving while black. All this stuff has connected this sort of broader fervor around law enforcement. So I want to give us a very clear-minded view of this stuff because, my friends, the truth oftentimes is not seen on the ground. It is seen by redirecting your vision to the stars, to the sky. This is why in many religions, especially Christianity, there's reference of fire from heaven. When Elijah went to the prophets of Baal and fire came down, it wasn't that fire actually came down, although many people believe it did. It's that fire represents illumination, and illumination represents the sort of broadest reaches of our understanding. But the discussion around police and police reform is staying on the ground. There is no illumination. There is no fire from heaven. There is no pensive thought into it. So I'm going to do my best to inject that into this conversation today, because I do believe that police reform is necessary. But police reform is not simply about statutes. It's about values. Let's get into that right now. So, any reasonable person is going to have to look at the history of an institution before they critique an institution, or else they're critiquing what they're seeing right now. What they're seeing right now may be a microcosm of what happened before. So, policing in America is an experiment, much like America itself. Now, it is a localized experiment which has taken many forms and faces over the years. So that means that policing is not a universal constant or facet of the American experiment. It is deeply implied when the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights urge for protection of individuals' rights, but it is not explicitly stated. So it is an implied feature of our existence, not implicitly stated. We're getting into the problems very quickly here. But let's watch this. Walk with me. So, the American principles do indeed stand independent of policing itself. But American principles, recognizing the human equality and then cementing the protections for property rights, cementing the protections for life and liberty, they do require a policing mechanism to cement them. And regardless of what your political views are, whether that policing mechanism is private or public or whatever, they require a policing mechanism. That's just very simple. So policing actually began, it had its genesis as night watches in the colonies. Now, night watches were largely inefficient because, the night watchers were very unprofessional. They would oftentimes get lazy. They weren't doing their job. They were not embracing. They were not stepping into the role that they were assigned. And this is a problem in life, my friends. A lot of us refuse to step into the roles we're assigned because we think that other things are more important. If you're assigned something, if you go into something voluntarily, you ought to give it your best shot or don't do it at all. Human beings are finite engines of brilliance who can only split their energy so much before they just collapse. So you should probably not do that. But anyway, so after this catastrophe of the night watches, policing began in Boston in 1838. The New York City established a police force in 1845, and then by the 1880s, most major American cities had police forces. It's important to understand that there were slave patrols, but it is a myth to say that slave patrols are the original form of policing, because in the North there were no slave patrols. Slave patrols originated in the South. It's fallacious to say that slave patrols are the foundation of modern policing. In the Southern United States, slave patrols do have a relationship with what became sheriff's departments, but they are not the foundation of modern policing. So, policing, however, its foundation was social appetites. Policing was basically created to respond to vices like prostitution, like gambling, like alcohol. And they were not always above approach, these police officers, which is why there were private law enforcement agencies like the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which actually provided security for President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War and helped thwart terroristic attacks. They were also employed due to this sort of rampant corruption within public policing agencies. And sometimes the police were paid off to turn a blind eye to prostitution, to gambling, to alcoholism. And then you had a guy called Vollmer, whose model came in the early 1990s and established state polices, so police became more professionalized and regimented. And then, of course, policing continued throughout the years, and eventually there was community policing adopted in the 70s. But policing was also a major force in prohibition. It was also a major force in the civil rights movement, both suppressing and protecting, mostly suppressing civil rights protests in the South. The Stonewall riots were caused by police intrusion. And then, of course, as the genealogy continues, policing especially changed after Columbine, the school shooting that happened, because police became more regimented and militarized in their responses to certain incidences. Then after 9/11, policing just completely and utterly shifted. Policing became about counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, and that gave birth to the the Department of Homeland Security and other apparatuses of the government, which have become more intrusive and involved in American life every day. So what is the core problem of all of this? The core problem of all of this is not that policing is inherently racist, because I don't see evidence of that inherent racism. I see incidental racism, and there's a difference. If I'm incidentally racist, that means I'm in the presence of racism, but I'm not made out of racism. You see, the man who can maintain himself in the presence of evil, in the presence of pain, in the presence of sorrow, in the presence of suffering, he who can maintain himself in the presence of these vices and still keep with himself the sort of consistency of his solitude, the consistency of his being, that is a great man. So we need to take that sort of specimen of greatness, maintaining yourself by being consistent in the midst of inconsistency, in the midst of vices and forces, and we need to translate that into our institutions. The problem is, the policing itself was not established in furtherance of a universal principle. Policing itself was established to reinforce social appetites and social beliefs. So if we're going to talk about policing in America, we need to talk about value reform, not statutory reform. There are many proposals to reform the police in America, many which are good, by the way. The idea of getting rid of qualified immunity, which is essentially a government shield for police officers, which makes it incredibly hard for victims of misconduct to sue, because apparently if everyone could hold the police accountable, there'd be less police officers, which may be a defect in the appetites of certain police officers rather than a defect in the system. But I digress. There are just so many things, getting rid of civil asset forfeiture. But all of these police reform tactics, watch this. They are cut from the same cloth as the origins of police are. These are also social appetites, which do not address the core problem of American policing, and that is it lacks any universal principles that it is founded upon. It lacks that. So social values, my friends, just as it did in 1838 when Boston, still influence and drive policing in America. Again, prohibition was a social value implemented through policing. The prohibition of casinos and gambling is still a social value that was exercised through policing. The illegalization of drugs, which I will address in a moment, is a social value exercised through policing. Sodomy laws, which imprisoned gay men or men in general who just did things that were not considered proper for many years, was a social value exercised through policing. Obscenity laws, which quite literally jailed and handcuffed musicians, brought them before courts for saying things which society deemed to be improper without actually justifying that in universals and principles. That was a social value exercised through policing. You get my point here? America, a lot of our communities, with our expectations, a lot of our individuals have not changed since 1835. We've sort of broadened the limits of our thinking. We have gotten over a lot of our race issues, but we are still wanting to have the government enforce our arbitrary social values that are not attached to any deeper philosophical justifications, or at least any legitimate ones. Now, there are plenty of arguments as to why the police should police moral behavior. This goes all the way back to Aristotle and the idea of the polis, and you can't have virtue without the government, and it's all bunk, because it rejects the fundamental principle of human freedom and human action, which is the basis for any kind of virtue, which is the basis for any kind of character, which is the basis for every single thing that these people who want to enforce the law on other people arbitrarily want. You cannot have virtue without first having freedom. The brilliant Frank Meyer made this point several times, and he even went a step further and said this is the foundational ethos of American libertarianism, American conservatism, rather. And you also see social values exercised through zoning and blight laws. There are certain communities that have no interest in having certain industry in their communities, and they will use the police, they will use the government to keep that out. So, my friends, police reform cannot happen until we do a few things. Number one, give a stable foundation based upon universal principles to policing in America. This can be achieved, in my personal opinion, through a constitutional amendment. And then number two, do our best to insulate police from the social values of the people they serve, and rather predicate them again on universal ideas and principles, universal conditions, like the idea of protecting property rights and not taking property rights away without due process through a practice called civil asset forfeiture. The idea of not penalizing victimless crimes, because that is a violation of my right to property, my right to self-ownership, and submitting that through law. There are so many universal ideas which are endemic to the structure of the American experiment that each and every one of us can demand that every policing agency, local, state, federal, follow in America. But if the conversation is always going to be about statutory reform without first reforming values, you will get nowhere. Now, there have been points throughout history in which policing was targeted in an attempt to insulate them from politicians. But what that really did, that just made them a little bit more distant and made them a little bit more bureaucratic. So, we have to have fundamental reforms to the value systems, not just the statutory incidences, the value systems, which constitute the basis for modern-day American policing, or we will get absolutely nowhere, and we will continue to get on the unjust violations of rights. We have to have reforms to how the NSA and the DHS and the ATF conduct themselves. We have to have reform. A lot of these victimless crimes would never happen if things like owning a firearm they didn't register were not illegal. If things like, selling drugs, a lot of them wouldn't happen because they don't have a legitimate basis to them, because they are not founded in moral righteousness. So, if we're going to have police reform, let's do a few things. Again, constitutional amendment, predicate policing on universal values, and make sure to understand that police themselves are not evil people. The system they're in is flawed, but officerial discretion is a very, 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 very big part of all of this. When we reform our values and we enshrine those values into law, then I think that policing will be a much less contested thing in America. It'll still have problems, of course, but I think it'll be much less. I think that the violations of liberty that abound will be also much less. So, my friends, think on it, consider these arguments, and if you want to support me, patreon.com/officialcwatson, or PayPal, officialcwatson@gmail.com, or join my locals, christianwatson.locals.com, or my Discord, which will be in the description below, I love you guys, and please stay pensive. Bye-bye, guys.